Hello, Misfits, and welcome! In this episode, I want to talk all about villains and what makes them memorable and good in some of our favorite stories. When we're writing and crafting and creating stories, we want that perfect villain that is scary but memorable, and you kind of hate them but love them all at the same time. And I want to talk about what makes villains like that. What makes them special and memorable and make them so deliciously evil. And I should clarify, when I talk about villain, I don't mean your sort of low-level kind of mini-boss type person. I'm talking about the one that you fight at the very end of the story. In my mind, there are two kind of levels of villain here. You have your Darth Vader type that is like personally chasing around the heroes and is physically confronting them and fighting them. And then you have your more Sauron, Darth Sidious type that he's personally responsible for the trouble that the heroes are facing, but he's sort of a back in the shadows, sort of in the background, kind of pulling the strings type person. So those are our two levels of villain. Both are perfectly valid. Both are wonderful examples of villains. You can have both at the same time, like in Star Wars, or you can pick one or the other. It really doesn't matter. They both actually kind of hit the same points that I'm going to talk about. So whatever you prefer, whichever route you decide to take, just know that those are both perfectly acceptable types of villains. So in my mind, I can boil down what makes a good villain into 4 points, okay? And I want to talk about each one and sort of explain my reasoning behind why I think these are necessary qualities or aspects that the villain should have, and what makes that contribute to how great this villain will be and how memorable they will be to the audience, to your heroes. So, number 1, I think it's really, really important to introduce the villain early in the story. And when I say that, I don't mean that you necessarily have to introduce the villain to the heroes specifically early, but I think at the very least the audience should know that there is a force of evil, and this is ultimately what the heroes are going to have to overcome in this story. Number 2, I think it's incredibly crucial that the villains show up frequently throughout the story. They should be a constant threat, showing up to thwart the heroes' plans and kind of keep them from progressing the way they want to. I think that's super vital because it builds up that tension and that frustration you feel every time you see that villainous character. And then by the end of the story, when you either defeat them or redeem them or what have you, you've had this long sort of relationship of having to deal with them and constantly being bothered by them, and it makes that so much more impactful. Number 3, I think it's important that the villain have some sort of tie to one or more of the heroes. Either they are personally connected to them in some way, or they have personally affected the heroes in some way. They either know the heroes from their past, or they hurt them or someone they know in some way. There needs to be some sort of personal layer to this relationship between the heroes and the villain. Again, we're trying to build up this sort of tension and these feelings and these layers of depth to this character, so that by the end, whether they've been redeemed or defeated, that feels earned, and it feels like there's a lot of weight behind that. And number 4, I think your villain needs to be fundamentally flawed, outside of just being evil. This flaw needs to inform their actions, and it needs to also contribute and lead to their downfall. This flaw could be anything from being self-conscious about some aspect of themselves. It could be their arrogance or hubris. They could be driven by fear. They could be driven by greed. There needs to be some sort of flaw aside from just being evil that is causing them to do what they do and make the decisions that they make. We are trying to tell a story where we understand why the villain fell, what led to their downfall, and these flaws that we bake into their character are going to help tell that story. Okay, so those are my 4 kind of brief pointers, but I want to give some examples of villains and go through and show how they hit all of these marks. Let's start with Sauron, okay? So Sauron, the force of evil in The Lord of the Rings, you meet him pretty dang early on. It's early on that you are introduced to him as an evil entity and as a force. Do you meet him personally? No, but you know that he is there, and you know that his evil presence has had an impact on the land. And he does constantly have his minions and forces show up to disrupt the progress of the heroes. So that's 1 and 2 right there. You meet him early, and he is constantly showing up and posing a threat to the heroes. Number 3, he does have ties to the heroes, and he has personally affected them in some way. He sends his wraiths to hunt Frodo down and personally injures Frodo. The orcs under his control kill Boromir, and that has a very personal weight and tie to that ties Frodo and the Fellowship to him as a villain. And number 4, he is, of course, fundamentally flawed, and it's more than just him being evil. He sort of has this want for power and this want for control, and that in and of itself isn't necessarily evil. It's the lengths to which he has gone to acquire that has made him evil. And that greed and that hunt for power does lead to his downfall. He creates the ring to give himself more power, but ultimately it's also one of his greatest weaknesses, because once it's destroyed, that's kind of it, right? So that's Sauron. Let's talk about Strahd. Let's get a D&D character in there. So number 1, you do meet, or at least are introduced to the character of Strahd fairly early on. You can either adjust the story and introduce him personally to the heroes, or at the very least, he has written a letter that has, sort of pulled the characters into Barovia and sort of manipulated that. Or you go to Barovia and you're very quickly introduced to the threat of Strahd and him looming over that town. So kind of off the bat, you're going to be introduced to Strahd either personally or through other characters within the first level of that game. Number 2 shows up frequently to constantly mess with the good guys. Yeah, that does happen. He has his minions and spies that he is constantly sending around to kind of keep an eye on the party and mess with them in their progress. He can personally show up and attack the party. He's a constant threat, and he's constantly kind of thwarting the heroes' plans to try and escape this hellish land. Does he have personal ties to the good guys, or has he affected them in some way? If you're playing the game correctly, Strahd should have some sort of personal effect on the party, whether it's simply him trapping them in Barovia, or if they become really close with Irina, he's of course personally affected her, which would kind of make them upset for her and want to protect her. Or if he's attacking the party constantly, and he may have personally injured a member of the party and one of the heroes. So yeah, he's personally affecting and personally attached and tied to these characters in some way. And then, is he fundamentally flawed outside of just being evil? Absolutely. He's very self-conscious of his age and appearance. And he has this undying love for Tatiana, but she sees him as old. And so that self-consciousness of his age is what leads him to sell his soul and become a vampire. So yes, he is fundamentally flawed, and it leads to his downfall. Because, I mean, ultimately, vampirism, he sold his soul and he does become evil and ends up being kind of the one you have to destroy just to win the game and get out. Let's look at another character. Let's look at Darth Vader. So you meet Vader very early. Opening shot of A New Hope, you're introduced to Darth Vader. He shows up constantly to mess with the heroes. He is always on their tail. They're always having to fight him or run away from him. He, of course, has personal ties to the heroes. He's Luke's father and Leia's father. And he killed Obi-Wan, so there's that sort of connection there as well. And he is fundamentally flawed. He kind of feels almost too much. He has high emotions. He's a very emotional person. He has a lot of attachments. He's also very arrogant and also has this sort of quest and hunger for power. And it does lead him to his downfall. He tries to do too much and is unable to face reality. And so when bad things happen, he sort of spirals and gets sort of turned to the dark side. Let's look at one more, maybe. Let's get an anime one in there. Lelouch. Let's look at Lelouch from Code Geass. So, you meet him very early, and he's constantly kind of messing with the good guys' plan, although Lelouch is a special case because he's a sympathetic villain, but he is constantly thwarting their plans, and kind of whenever they progress, he takes them a step back because he has all these master plans. Of course, he has ties to the hero, and they've sort of personally affected each other. He's fundamentally flawed. I would say one of his bigger flaws is that he isn't very trusting and he's very, very isolated. Perhaps if he had been more trusting of some of his good friends and let them in on what his plans were, then things wouldn't have turned out the way they had. He's sort of a complex character there. And he's a good example of what I would call optional number 5, okay? Making your villain sympathetic. To have a good villain, they don't have to be sympathetic. Let me make that clear. You do not have to have a sympathetic villain. Your bad guy can just be bad. But if you want to, you can create a sort of sympathetic reason for their fall and maybe prepare them for a redemption arc. That's totally valid, totally okay, but it's not necessary. So these are my tips for creating a good, memorable villain. I could go on about some of the villains that I've put in my own stories, but I will not. I know that some people are still watching through Campaign 1 and stuff, and I haven't revealed much in Campaign 2. So I'll leave that at that. But this was really, really fun. I love a good villain, and some of my favorite characters in my games have been my villainous characters, just because they're just so fun and interesting. And it's just so cool to sort of try to bullet point what makes them good. I've had many a conversation with my D&D group and sort of my writer friends to sort of discuss what makes a villain good and who their favorite villains are and have been in the stories they've read and watched and played in. So this was a lot of fun. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. Also, put a little comment below telling me some other things that maybe you'd want to see in future videos. That would be great. Also, if you want to make sure you don't miss anything, you can sort of hit the bell, or you can follow us on Instagram or Twitter. I'm a little bit more faithful to updating Instagram, but I believe that's just at misfit_adventurers. So, hope to see you there, and have a good day. I think I figured out my tripod situation, by the way, so that's good. Train's still there. Train's still there. So I guess this is gonna be my bit at the end of the video. It's just gonna be me complaining about a train that is taking forever to leave. Go. Goodbye, train. Fare thee well, Thomas. I am done with you today.